Please welcome Richard Wolff to Google.
Thank you. Okay, thank you all for spending time a little bit with me. Let me tell you exactly what I'm going to do and then try to do it. I want to tell you about the economic system in which you live. And like any object of people trying to figure things out, there have been differences about how to understand economic systems from the beginning. I don't want to bore you by taking you back to any economics class you may remember having had in college. If your experience was like mine, this is a memory you'd rather not bring back, for good reason usually. But if some of it is still in your mind, you may recall that people like Adam Smith and David Ricardo and Karl Marx and John Stuart Mill and John Keynes and a whole lot of other people whose names you've probably heard all tried to analyze the economy, but they ended up, many of them, doing it in radically different ways. And I mean really different. They didn't see the same thing when they looked at the economy. They didn't understand the mechanisms that make it work. They didn't understand in the same way where it was going. That is, it's been a field characterized by fundamental differences. As big a difference as whether you believe the sun goes around the earth or the other way around, and many other examples that I could give. And that's never changed. Economics has been what philosophers call an agonistic field, a place in which different ways of understanding the economy contest with one another, fight it out. Some win, some lose, and those losers sometimes come back and win later. Let me give you an example that you may know about. Because of the Great Depression of the 1930s, the confidence in the capitalist system being able to solve its problems as they arose collapsed. From 1929 to 1941, the United States had unemployment rates hovering around 20 to 25%. That's 5 or 6 times the unemployment we have now. And what we have now is a problem. Try to imagine that. Those were years, the 1930s, when the total output of goods and services shrank each year from what it was the year before. It's not surprising that people who were living in a capitalist system worked like that, raised lots of questions. And then there were those who believed, oh no, it's okay, it's a temporary thing, nothing to worry about. The system is wonderfully configured in such a way that it can solve its problems, and it will. Just wait, 6 months, a year, another year, and so on. But there were too many people suffering too much to wait. And one, a brilliant one, a fellow in England named John Maynard Keynes, basically had the courage to stand up and say, this system isn't working. And if we continue to keep our faith in it, despite the fact that it isn't working in obvious ways that we can see every day. He mentioned, by the way, people sleeping in doorways in London, where he was British, people out of work in huge numbers, people whose wages were going down, not up, et cetera, et cetera. He said, if we don't face it, there's going to be a revolution, and we're not going to have any capitalism at all. He liked capitalism, but he felt that letting things be handled by the private sector was self-destructive lunacy. And he developed an analysis which we now call Keynesian economics. But it saw the economy radically different from what preceded it. And that Keynesian became the dominant economics in the world for most of the period, roughly the 1940s to the 1970s. And then it was all pushed out, and we had a return of what existed before the 1930s. It was almost as if the memory of the Great Depression and all the troubles it had. And by the way, if you're interested, you know, John Steinbeck is a good one to read, give you a feeling of the Great Depression if you've never read that, or seen the movies of Grapes of Wrath or Mice and Men. But in the 1970s, it all went the other way. The Keynesians were dethroned, and we started looking at the economy again in a different way. That's the time of Reagan and Thatcher. The private economy which had been excoriated for failing in the Great Depression, was suddenly rehabilitated and made the be-all and end-all that would solve everything. 70s, 80s, 90s, it would have continued, except in 2008, this capitalist system we live in crashed again, the second time in 75 years. We're talking a major collapse. For those of you who don't follow these things, in the autumn of 2008, September to December, here in New York, we came that close to an economy that would have stopped functioning. By stopped functioning, I mean the kinds of things you don't think can happen, but we came that close. No milk, no bread, no buses, no nothing. Terrible. We're still in the after effects of that. Here we are almost a decade later. Like the Great Depression, it has raised again the question, gee, what about this economic system? Only now we have to ask it in a different way, and that's really what I want to talk to you about. Because we can't go back and repeat our own history. We can't now say, oh, let's bring the government back in the way Keynes believed you needed to do, fix this capitalist system, manage this capitalist system, because if you leave it to itself, if you leave it to the business community, look what happened in 1929, and look what happened in 2008 again. And these are cataclysms. You read every few weeks now about an election, like the one a couple weeks ago in France, in which the entire society is being roiled around by the consequences of an economic system that isn't working real well and is producing new kinds of political characters. Even here in the United States, we have what at least most of us think of as a pretty weird political scene these days, don't we? And that's not just because a particular fellow got in, it's because of all the conditions that made it possible for him to get in and to do what he's doing. Okay. So let's talk about this capitalist system, remembering that people have always disagreed. The debates were not only between those who loved capitalism and felt it should be handled by the private business community being able to do its thing, deregulate, let the economy work, versus the Keynesians who loved the system but said in order to make it work, the government has to come in and make things happen, because left to itself, the system collapses like in 29 and 2008. Turns out those were not the only two perspectives. There's also a perspective that says the problems of capitalism go far deeper than whether or not there's more or less government intervention. For such people, this whole issue is secondary. What's their point of view? And it's the one I want to present to you a little bit. Their point of view is that if you look at the capitalist system, with or without government intervention, all the key levers of power are in the hands of the people who run that institution, which is now the place where most production of goods and services happens. And that institution is called the corporation, the capitalist corporation. We are discussing this in one of them, aren't we? It is a powerful institution, as you all know. And so this approach says, let's take a look at how it works and see what consequences come from that. Before I do it, I need to tell you honestly and clearly where this approach comes from, this looking at the organization of production as it is done in a corporation, which is the dominant form of modern capitalism. The origin of this way of thinking is in the hands of critics of capitalism. This point of view comes from people down through a couple of hundred years that capitalism has been the dominant system in the world. It's not very old. Like every other system, slavery, feudalism, any of the others, capitalism has always had people who love it and people who hate it, just about like everything else. Critics, admirers, celebrants, skeptics. And what I'm about to tell you is there's a tradition, which some of you I'm sure know, of criticism of capitalism. It has many contributors, but the name that has come to dominate is the name of Karl Marx. And this is often called Marxian economics in the sense that it's influenced more or less, that varies from individual to individual, by the critical way that Karl Marx developed his analysis of capitalism. I'm not sure whether I should take a moment out to remind you all of who Karl Marx was, but then again, maybe it's worthwhile. Karl Marx was born in 1818. That's very important because that's the first generation after the French Revolution, and Marx was a tremendous admirer of the French Revolution. The slogans on the banners of the French, liberty, equality, fraternity, those were the three words of that revolution in 1789, were absolutely the love of the whole generation of which Marx was a part. And they all understood the French Revolution pretty much in the same way, that what the French did was to get rid of feudalism, the old system, and bring in capitalism, the new system. And that by doing so, they would bring in liberty, equality, and fraternity. Or to use the modern language, a democratic system. But Marx came a little later. So Marx was able, by the time he becomes a young man, to see about 50 years worth of development of capitalism in Europe. It began in England, moved to France and the Low Countries, and then spread eventually to the whole world. Marx was 50 years in. And he looked around, Western Germany, that's where he was born, France, where he lived a bit, and then in England, where he lived most of his adult life. He looked around, and by the way, it's the England of Dickens, so if you want to understand what he was seeing, remember Oliver Twist. The England of his time was certainly capitalist. Feudalism was gone. So was Paris. So was Frankfurt. And Marx acknowledged that. Capitalism was a dynamic, developing system. But where was the liberty, equality, and fraternity? Nowhere. There wasn't any. Again, if you want to see what I mean, read Dickens. He'll describe to you the absence of liberty, equality, and fraternity in 25 ways. Or if you want the French version, Balzac, or Zola, or any of the others who were writing about these periods. So Marx, young radical that he was, from an upper middle class family, educated at the university, which means he's one of the 3 or 4% of the people who had such an education at that time, he drew a conclusion. The French Revolution was wonderful for bringing in capitalism. But capitalism, it turned out, was not the vehicle or the means to bring people liberty, equality, or fraternity. And so his life work was to answer the question, why not? What is it about capitalism in the 19th century, which is when he lived, that prevented it from bringing the liberty, equality, fraternity, democracy, all those wonderful things? And I'm going to tell you his conclusion, and then we're going to go back and see how he got to it and why he got to it. His conclusion was that capitalism was not only unable to bring it, but that capitalism was a fundamental obstacle to ever achieving it. And that therefore, the human race, if it wanted liberty, equality, fraternity, and democracy, would have to devise a system other and different from capitalism, or else spend its entire lives bumping up against the limits of a system that cannot allow for, has never allowed for, liberty, equality, fraternity, or democracy. Not really. Okay, so how did Marx get to this? And why am I going to present an analysis of it to you? Well, let's go back to the corporation. That instrument, that institution through which goods and services are produced. Everything Google makes is the product of the Google Corporation, which the Google Corporation makes sure we know, as all other corporations do likewise. It's the institutional form in which the work gets done. The raw materials, the tools, the equipment to produce the output, which is then marketed around the world. That's how it's done. And in Marx's image, in Marx's head, therein lies the problem. How is that organized? Let's look, he said, closely into this. And then he did. And again, I'm going to save us a lot of time by summarizing what he found and why it's so relevant. His analysis goes something like this. The workplace, the corporation, but by the way, it applies if you're not incorporated, if you're an unincorporated business or a partnership or a family outfit, the analysis applies there too. But since most production in the United States is organized in corporations and more around the world too, that's the appropriate institution for me to focus on. In the corporation, something very interesting happens every day. The key decision makers are two groups of people. One group are the shareholders, the people who literally, in the way capitalism works, own the corporation by owning shares of it. They're literally shares of ownership. Shares, however, are only owned in the main by rich people or by a few institutions. To give you just one statistic here from the United States, 1% of shareholders own about 2/3 of the shares. If you ever wonder who the 1% are that folks talk about, that's as good a group as any. They are the major shareholders, we call them in economics. They're literally a handful of people in most corporations. That is, your grandmother may have left you when she died 11 shares of something, but you're not a major shareholder. This may come as a shock. I don't want to upset you, but you're not a major shareholder. A major shareholder owns millions of shares. Can be a bank, can be a wealthy person, can be a foundation, a variety of holders of these major shares. But it's a tiny group, 20, 50 people, groups, institutions own all the shares, except for the handful that grandmothers leave as parting gifts. And the way a corporation works, again, for those of you who are not familiar, once a year there's an election. And the shares vote for something called the board of directors. That's usually a group of 12 to 20 people. They're on the board of directors. If you ever wondered, some of you may have had as a career objective to become a member of a board of directors, you probably noticed that that's a good place to be, and so I'm about to tell you how to do that. You have to get elected by the shareholders. That's how everybody got there. Once a year, the shareholders have a vote, and here's how the vote works. You get one vote for every share you own. So if your grandmother left you 11 shares, you get 11 votes. If you are Chase Manhattan Bank and you own, for your various accounts, 27 million shares, then the vice president you send to the annual meeting of the shareholders votes to 20 million shares. You could think that you're just like him, but you understand you're not. If 1% of the people own the bulk of the shares, that's the 1% who decide all these elections. And that's indeed how it normally works. So the 12 or 15 people that are on the board of directors, they make the decisions. Sometimes with more influence from the major shareholders, if they muddle in there, sometimes with less. But it really doesn't matter, because even if you add together the 15 to 20 individuals who are on the board of directors to the 10 or 20 or 30 individuals who are major shareholders, those people, that 50 people, more or less, make all of the key decisions for every corporation that works like this, which is 99% of them. Let me be clear with you so we all are on the same page. This board of directors decides what the company produces, what objects are made, what services and goods are produced. Number two, how they will be produced, what technology will be used. Number three, where the production will take place. And finally, what to do with the profits that all of this work generates. This board of directors and the major shareholders make all those decisions. Those are the key decisions any enterprise ever makes. Meanwhile, there is a large number of people, 500, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, hundreds of thousands, millions, who are employees of the corporation. They all, of course, have to live with the decisions that the board of directors and the major shareholders make. Well, let's give you an example. We're going to close this factory or office here in New York, and we're going to move it to China. Have a nice day. Or we're going to substitute these machines for these working people and lay them off. Have a nice day. We're going to take the profits to which the labor of all the employees contributed, and we're going to decide to use it for an advertising budget or beautiful new shrubbery outside the main office or whatever it is we want, because that's who we are. We make the decisions. Who's the we? The board of directors, 15 to 20 people, and the major shareholders, another 20, 30 people. Marx finds this intriguing, and so do I. This is an interesting way to make the fundamental economic decisions of a society. Because what you are essentially doing and saying, whether you face up to it or not as a culture, is that there's going to be a tiny group of people who make all the key decisions that everybody else has to live from, on, and with. But now to drive the point home, the mass of people, the employees to begin with, but the larger community in which every corporation lives and functions, they all have to live with the consequences. But they are excluded from participating in making the decision. Let me say that again to make real sure it's with us. The mass of people in our economic system are required to live with the consequences of the decisions made by the corporate leaderships, decisions from which they are excluded legally and in practice, de jure and de facto. Whatever else you call this system, it is not democratic. In the communities where we live, we insist upon having votes. We say that the mayor or the governor or the senator or the president makes decisions that we all have to live with, and therefore we, who have to live with the decisions, must be able to participate in making them. But when we go to work in a capitalist system, we cross the threshold into the office, the store, or the factory, and we put all of that aside. We don't demand it, we don't require it, and we don't have it. Now back to Marx. Herein, in that situation I just described summarily for you, Marx said, lies the reason why capitalism, despite its hopes and dreams of the people who brought us capitalism, that it would usher in liberty, equality, fraternity, has proven itself unable to do that. Because it turns out, Marx argues, that if you put the power of directing what goes on in an economy in the hands of a tiny number of people, you can't really be surprised if they make the decisions that keeps them in that charmed place. Can you? So why are we surprised to learn, as I'm sure many of you know, that over the last 40 years, for example, here in the United States, just to take an example, corporations, boards of directors, and major shareholders have decided to take the profits that everyone helped to produce. By the way, you know how we know that everyone helps to produce the profits? You know how that happens. That happens every year, the proof of it, at the Christmas party. That's when the chief executive, a little wobbly from too much punch, gets up on a chair and thanks everybody for the contribution every person in this firm made to our successful year. And then having thanked you, the chairman and the other members of the board go off and decide what to do with what you kindly helped to produce. So it shouldn't come as a surprise if the last 40 years turns out that what has happened is that those corporations, those boards of directors and major shareholders, decided to take a huge part of the profits that were earned and give it to themselves in the form of dividends to shareholders, which is what they are, and spectacular pay packages to the chief executives who are on boards of directors. This should surprise nobody. But let's take some other examples that are remarkable. Corporations have decided, and Google is an important player in this, to do what we call in economics automation. Over the last 30, 40 years, we have really replaced huge numbers of jobs that people hold by computers and robots. It's very interesting. That is driven by profit. The boards of directors calculate, they bring in economists like me, and they calculate what we would pay for workers and all the versus what it would cost to buy and maintain these computers, these robots, whatever the automation form is. And they make the decision based on what's better for their profits, because that's how corporations work. That's what they do. And then they make an interesting decision. If the machinery is more profitable, they buy it, they install it, and they turn to the workers and they say, "You're fired, have a nice day." And those workers go off and have maybe a nice day. Probably not. They're fired. They're unemployed. Hey, we have no idea. I take that back. We do know what happens to them. In stunning numbers, they get depressed. They get sick. They start desperately looking for jobs. If they don't find them pretty soon, they start being willing to accept jobs that they are overtrained for, jobs they are underpaid for, etc., etc. They may get angry. They may do violent things. The social costs of all of this are staggering and always have been. But that's none of the problem of the corporation. It bears, in a capitalist system, no responsibility for that at all. If there are costs of laying all those people off, those are the problems of those people and of their friends and relatives, neighbors, and the communities in which they live to struggle with as best they can. Marx says this is really interesting, because in many situations, it's easy to show, don't need to be a Marxist for that the social costs of the unemployed are much larger than the profits gained by the private corporations who made the decision to fire these people. But because the private corporations got the profit without having to pay the cost, it was profitable for them, even though it was socially an unprofitable move to make. It's the way the system works. Okay, now let's put it all together. Marx argues that leaving things in the hands of the capitalist corporation, and you can see now why a bit more government intervention or a bit less is really beside the point. Because with more or less government intervention, you're not changing the basic way the capitalist enterprise is organized, with a tiny group of people making all the key decisions and doing so in a way that replicates their situation, understandably, and unfortunately replicates that of everybody else, too, along the way. In fact, let's even push it further, as Marxists should. If the government doesn't just regulate, but let's suppose the government goes a step further, fires all the private boards of directors, takes the property away from the shareholders, and says this is now a government enterprise, and then puts into the board of directors not individuals elected by shareholders, they're all gone, but officials designated by the state apparatus. You 20 people will now run this factory. That's a little bit like what happened in the Soviet Union in 1917. That didn't work out too well either. And why? Because it didn't change the internal structure of that enterprise. Yes, instead of privately elected people, as in private capitalism, they had state officials. Interesting change, but that doesn't change the fundamental problem. And Marx pointed to that as the issue. The way this is organized is fundamentally antagonistic to ever getting liberty, equality, or fraternity, or democracy, if that's what you're interested in. Now, this is a very powerful way of analyzing things. But Marx was a very sophisticated thinker and wanted to drive it home on the most intimate way that one can by looking very closely at the employer-employee relationship. And again, this is an elaborate piece of work he did. It takes some time to work through, and I'm going to give you a heroic short summary, but I think you'll understand it real well. Let's start with the employee who's looking for a job. Could be me, could be you. And you go and you meet an employer who's got a job. And you sit down and you discuss it. And the employer explains you're to come, Monday through Friday at 8:30, and you stay till 4:30, or whatever it is. You'll sit over there, you'll do work with this machine on that piece of paper, whatever it is. And then you get to that touchy point. How much are you going to get paid? And to make my example very simple, let's just use the number 20 bucks an hour. You're going to be paid $20 an hour for whatever it is you just came to work. At that point, Marx says, let's stop the film, stop the whole thing, and let's be clear about what happens here, because everybody kind of knows it and yet hasn't faced it. And I suspect that's still true. Having been a professor of economics for 50 years helps you to get a sense of whether it's true or not. You know, Marx makes it very clear, but you know what I'm about to say, that the only reason any employer will ever give you $20 for an hour of your work is this. That hour, adding you to whatever the payroll already is, hiring you, in that hour, you're going to make more goods or services for that company to sell than they would have if they didn't hire you. They know that. That's why they're hiring you. You're either going to make a better quantity or a better quality of whatever it is they produce. And the company's calculation is, it is worth it for me to hire you for $20 if and only if the extra hour of your labor will yield to me, the employer, more than $20 worth of extra output for me to sell. If it doesn't, I won't hire you, because it would be absurd. I would give you $20, you'd work for an hour, I'd sell the results of your extra work for $19, and I'd be down $1. I got an MBA, I know that's not good, I'm not going to do that. But this has enormous implications. First of all, and this is tough on Americans, it means that if you've spent a lifetime telling yourself you're never going to work for anybody who doesn't pay you what you're worth, I've got real bad news for you. That never happened, and it never will. That kind of statement to yourself is your way of avoiding to deal with the system in which you live. And I feel for you. You need help, but not the kind I provide. You live in a system in which the basis of the corporation is that difference. Or to use Marx's language, the worker produces a surplus over what he gets. And that's the name of the system, is to get it and to accumulate it. Wow. So what have we got in capitalism? We've got a system that has delivered us two extraordinary qualities. It has delivered us stunning instability. I always use the same joke at this point in what I present. If you lived with a person as unstable as this economic system, you would have moved out long ago. In 1929, it crashes, Crash lasts 11 years. In 2008, it crashes. We're still in it. For those of you who don't know, there's an agency in the United States called the National Bureau of Economic Research, which keeps track of the business cycle, is a polite term we call for instability. Between the end of the Great Depression, 1941, and the beginning of what we're in now, 2008, there were 11 more economic downturns. Every president of the United States has been a president over a downturn. That's how unstable the system is. And every president has promised during the downturn that if we just do whatever the things are he thinks we ought to do, we will overcome that crisis, overcome that downturn, and never have another one. Every president promised it. No president has ever delivered on this promise. That's why we're in one now. They all promised. They can't do it. The system's instability has been with it from the beginning. We average an economic downturn every 4 to 7 years in capitalism. For 300 years, no matter where capitalism has come to, that is what it brings with it. Keynesian economics was an attempt to cope with it. Didn't work out. We're still trying. We're still debating it. We live with a system that periodically throws millions of people out of work, undoes their family life, undermines their educations, it's unbelievable what we expect and what we accept. And the other thing capitalism has done, stunningly, is produce an inequality that is mind-bending. Of course, it's easy to see why if the boards of directors and the major shareholders decide what to do with the profits and give a lot of it to themselves, bingo, we've explained inequality. No mystery here. We don't need to do a lot of studies. That's been answered, that question. But the problem is it's the system that produces the inequality, not this or that law, or this or that rule, or this or that political candidate. This is a systemic problem, like our instability. The agency that keeps track of inequality in the world, the best one, is Oxfam in England. Some of you may know about it. They issue a report every year about world inequality. The famous number this last year was that something on the order of 86 of the richest people in the world together have more wealth than the bottom half of the population of the planet. That's about 3.5 billion people. Folks, this is a level of inequality that takes us back to the pyramids. Capitalism's achievement is a level of inequality and instability that should have long ago made people question, what are we doing, staying in, living with, accepting, especially uncritically, a system that works like this? But now a personal note. If any of this strikes you as remarkable, or new, or maybe hopefully even interesting, I'm a product of the American economic system, and I'm a product of the American education system. I was born in the United States, lived here all my life. This economic analysis I've just summarily presented to you in 40 minutes, I had to acquire on my own. Why? Because the institutions of, they like to call it, higher learning, I always used to wonder what then would be lower learning, then put it aside. Institutions of higher learning, they didn't teach me any of this. Let me stress that, none of it. So let me tell you about my education because it'll help drive the point home. As an undergraduate, I went to Harvard. I graduated magna cum laude from Harvard. That's supposed to mean something. Then I went to Stanford out in Palo Alto and got a master's degree in economics. And then I switched because my professor that I loved there died, and finished at Yale, where I got another master's in economics, a master's in history, and a PhD in economics. I'm loaded with the right degrees from the right places, aren't I? Now listen to this. Never in my education in those three institutions, in an economics course, was I ever assigned one word of Karl Marx. There is no excuse, no justification, nothing. You know what that's about? Fear. My professors were afraid to assign it, to read it, to think about it, to discuss it, or to debate it. It was the Cold War when I went to school. And we, the Americans, were arrayed against the Russians, like some are today, and others clearly not so much. Well, it's very hard to keep this straight. You have to know what color, who's got what jersey, otherwise you get confused as to who the friends and allies are. It is very confusing. My professors were not confused, it was real clear. So we weren't taught anything about any of this. We were taught neoclassical economics. That's capitalism is wonderful, fixes itself, nothing to worry about. Go back to watching TV. And the Keynesians who said, no, there's something to worry about, let the government come in. But the notion that there was a critical alternative to this way of thinking that came up with a different analysis and a different way of thinking and a different set of ideas of what we need to do next, oh no. None of my teachers ever said one word about it. Try to understand. This is like a taboo. They couldn't discuss it. Some of you have been wondering why, when we have economic troubles here in the United States, we seem so clumsy about solving them. We have had to pretend in economics that we don't have any problems, that we don't have a fundamentally troubled system, that we don't have anything to worry about, which means you're not real good at fixing it when it breaks down. For that, you'd have to face that it has lots of flaws. You'd have to look at how it broke down before and see what it is that might be amiss. We don't. So you live in an economic system that is now run by people who have no idea about everything I just told you. It's painful. I've had to teach all my life the conventional, neoclassical, Keynesian, but I've also taught this other. I know what my colleagues do, but they don't understand what I do. And I'm not the only one, I'm not suggesting that, but I'm a critic of the system because it makes sense to me that a system that works in the way I've described deserves some criticism, and I even dare to suggest that intelligent folks like you could thrive on hearing the criticism and thinking about it. Accept all of it? Of course not. But think about it, engage it. Come on, if you wanted to understand the family up the road that had 2 parents and 2 kids, would you decide to interview one of the 2 children, not 2, especially if you knew that one of the children thought it was the best family in the world, the other child thought this was a basket case of psychological dysfunction? Probably most of you would understand you got to talk to both of the children, and then you make up your own mind. Hear what they have to say. Hear the people who think capitalism is the best thing since sliced bread, but maybe also take a dare. Listen to the people who think it's critical, who think it's a system that never could do what it had promised. And finally, and I'm going to conclude with this, a system that is in no way necessary. What are we accepting? It's not inevitable. It never was. Oh, true, the people who like capitalism love to say it's the end of history, it's the final stage. But the people who articulated slavery said that. And the people who articulated feudalism said that. So of course the people who run capitalism say that, but the burden's on them. Every system we know of in human history has been born, evolved over time, and died. We know capitalism was born, and we know it's evolved. You know what the next stage is? Well, I won't go into that. You can figure that out. What would be an alternative? Well, in a way, everything I've said gives you the answer. If we have a system that's unstable, if we have a system that produces unspeakable inequality, a system that makes it profitable to fire large numbers of people, even if the social costs of their unemployment exceed the profits that the automation achieved. All of the things I've told you and many more. Those are all, every one of them, the results of how decisions are made inside the productive units of our economy, the factories, the stores, and the offices, by a tiny group of people who are not accountable to the people they employ. The people they employ are the majority. The people who are not accountable are the minority. That's why it's not democracy. It's the antithesis. Well, then the solution jumps right out at you. Democratize the enterprise. Make the decisions something that is done one person, one vote. Everybody who works in an enterprise has an equal say in deciding what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits that they all helped to produce. What a wonderful, interesting idea. Democracy in the workplace. Just think of a society in which you have not just democracy where you live, but democracy where you work. If it was good for the one, maybe it's good for the other. Maybe getting rid of the kings who told us what to do where we live is like getting rid of the board of directors who tells us what to do where we work. Because you know, it kind of matters. Being at work is what you do most of the adult life you have, is going to work. If democracy is a value that means something to you, it should have been instituted long ago where you work, because that's where you spend most of your time. Instead, you accept what? To live in a society you like to call democratic, even though the place where you spend most of your time is the antithesis of that, your workplace. The alternative is very old. Democratizing the workplace is not a new idea. It's ancient. Nowadays, it's called worker co-ops. So as good a name as any. What does it mean? A group of people getting together and making a decision. We're going to produce something. A software program, hamburgers, haircuts, it doesn't matter. And here's how we're going to do it. We're going to be a collective. We're going together to decide how to produce, where to produce, when to produce, all of that. And we're going to debate it, and then we're going to make a decision by majority vote. That's what we're going to do. We're going to run it that way. Human beings have been trying to do that for a long time. What you may not know is that human beings have done it often. You may not know that human beings are doing it right now, all over the place, including in the United States. And one of the reasons it's a perennial effort is because the systems that have existed, slavery, feudalism, capitalism, provoke people to be critical and to find their way, sooner or later, to this alternative. I'll give you just two examples as I bring this to a close. The most famous example is a corporation in Spain. Some of you may have heard about it. It's called the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation. Here's the story of this company. In 1956, Spain, which is where this company exists and is based, Spain was a very poor country. It had gone through a horrific civil war, and then there was World War II. Spain was a poor country to begin with, and it was devastated by the Civil War, and then by World War II. So in 1956, it was a very poor country. And in the Basque region, that's the northern part of Spain, on the southern side of the Pyrenees Mountains that separate Spain from France, the Basque people, who are their own kind of ethnicity, if you like, they have their own language and culture, very, very poor. They're Roman Catholic, as are most people in Spain, and they had a local priest. And he made a famous joke one day in church. He said, if we wait to have jobs for some capitalist or some employer to come here, we'll all die of old age. So what I suggest, he said, is that we become our own employer. In other words, set up a worker co-op, which he did. 6 workers and a priest. Fast forward to today. Mondragon Corporation, Mondragon Cooperative Corporation, is the 7th largest corporation in Spain. It has 100,000 workers. It is the biggest success story of the Spanish economy in the last half century. It is a collection of 150 to 200, depending on how you count, worker co-ops. In every one of its businesses, it's a conglomerate, services, manufacturing, and so on. In every one of its businesses, the workers collectively decide all of these issues. What to produce, how to produce, where to produce. Stunningly successful. Outcompeted dozens of capitalist enterprises who could not make it work in competition with them. They're so successful now that they have their own university, the Mondragon University, which will teach courses to anybody who's interested in how to organize a co-op, how to finance a co-op, how to manage a co-op, how to deal with the personnel problems of co-ops, etc. It's a well-developed program. Very successful. 2 interesting rules that might excite you. Rule number 1, the workers together hire and fire and evaluate the managers. I know I have to let that sink in. In other words, it's the opposite of what you have. The workers decide whether the managers were successful, and if they weren't, they're gone. They also have another rule. The highest paid person cannot get more than 8 times the income of the lowest paid person. That's how they solved the problem of inequality. Just gone. Not an issue. There is some inequality. 8 to 1 is still a hefty ratio, but I assume you know that the ratio of corporate CEOs to low-paid workers in American corporations is around 350 to 1, which is why we have the inequality that we have. And there are many more examples. A worker co-op would solve its problems in a different way, be a different economic system. Here's an interesting thing. Imagine a corporation confronted with the notion, gee, why are you hiring Americans who you have to pay a large amount of money to? Why don't you move to India? Well, you can pay much less. Capitalist corporation, as you know, has been doing lots of that. Worker co-op? Unlikely. The workers would be voting to destroy their jobs, their company, the benefits to the community of having the jobs there. They're not going to do that. You wouldn't have seen the exodus of jobs from this country for the last 30 to 40 years. It's really different. Much less inequality, much less loss of everything would be changed if we were able to have a rational discussion, debate here in the United States about a capitalist economic system versus a worker cooperative system. Maybe we would even be able to imagine an economic system starting out as capitalist, but which makes room for a large worker co-op sector across many industries. And you know what the rationale for it would be? Freedom of choice. Let Americans have the choice. You want to work in a top-down hierarchical corporation, or would you rather work in a democratic workplace? Would you like to buy from the one? Would you like to, for Americans to have that choice, there has to be a sector. We'd have to spend some money and make room for worker co-ops. And there is a country just doing it right now, committed to doing it anyway. And that'll be my final point, just to make clear that the reality of this is not some fancy, in the future, utopian dream. The second biggest political party in Great Britain is called the Labour Party. The leader of the Labour Party, a man named Jeremy Corbyn. His party has committed, they're running in a national election right now, his party has committed that and they've run governments before. They're like the Democratic Party here, the Republican here is the Conservatives in England. So he's committed that if the Labour Party wins, they'll pass this law, Part 1. Any existing business in England can continue as it is, but if it decides to close, or if it decides to sell itself to another business, or if it decides to go public, to issue shares, it must, before doing any of those things, give its own workers the right of first refusal. That's a legal term, meaning it has to offer to sell itself to its own workers as a co-op before it can do anything else. Part 2 of the bill, answers the question, where would the workers get the money to buy their own firm? Answer, the government will lend it to them. The British are committed to building a worker co-op sector precisely because of the problems, limits, failures of a capitalist system. But the most important thing is not the particular arguments for this. The most important thing is for you to face up to the fact you live in an economic system that isn't the beginning and end of anything, that is part of an evolving history, that has very serious flaws and faults, and that there's an enormous literature, including concrete, real experiences people have had all over the place, in doing better than capitalism. To insist that you don't have to think about it, you don't have to debate it, you don't have to listen to people who tell you about it, you don't have to read the books that are there for it, is a kind of self-imposed censorship that doesn't do anybody any good unless you really want the current system to continue no matter what the cost and no matter where it takes us. And I don't believe most of you in this room feel that way. Thank you very much for your attention. If there's time.
Yeah, we have just a couple minutes for questions, I think. Yeah, go up to the mics, please. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I was just wondering if you could speak maybe briefly to you offer up democracy as kind of the solution system. I'm wondering if you could speak to the efficacy of it, specifically with relation to dealing with the problem of capitalism. Like, why hasn't democracy as a governing system dealt with this problem, and why won't it have similar inefficiencies in the workplace?
Sure. Try to be as brief as I can. Marx tried to grapple with exactly that question. And basically, he and the many who have come since and tried to work with it make the argument that in the practical life of a capitalist corporation is a systemic disregard, negation, rejection of democracy. And that in fact, the way the corporation works, how it rewards disproportionately the people at the top, et cetera, it creates conditions that undermine what political democracy there is. And the best way to see that in this country, and again, I'm sure most of you know it, is that we in America, and in many other countries, we see our elections bought and sold. You can buy the advertising that you need, or you can't. If you can't, your effort to run politically is basically stymied from the beginning. It's not a coincidence that most of the candidates either are millionaires or depend on millionaires to donate to them. And the likelihood of millionaires that are going to donate to a critic of capitalism is slim in a country like this. Unless and until a movement develops that, of course, can change all of that. And in a way, the Bernie Sanders' ability to raise large amounts of money from small donations is the beginning of signs in this country, too, that, in a sense, the jig is up. But the system is itself undemocratic, and it undercuts, because it has to. Let me put it in the most dramatic way I can. If a society produces greater and greater inequality, you all understand what that means. Tiny group of people with a lot of stuff, and a lot of other people just barely making ends meet. The people who have a lot, they aren't stupid. They understand the danger of democracy and of universal suffrage. Because sooner or later, if a tiny group of people have all the wealth and everybody doesn't, everybody's going to think the one thing we have is the vote. The one thing we have is political democracy. And we can use our numerical majority in politics to undo what capitalism has achieved in economics. We can do that by taxing, we can do that by expropriation. There's a lot of ways of doing that. The rich understand that. They've got to neuter the political system. They can't let it function in the appropriate way because it's too dangerous for them. And so they buy it. That's been the solution. And I think that problem has never been solved, not by this law or that law, because you could find the way for these inequalities of wealth to represent themselves in the political system. The notion of worker co-op is not a notion that there will be pure efficiency, whatever exactly that is. Economists do not agree on what efficiency is or means or how to measure it, but put that aside. There will be inefficiencies in a worker co-op. They'll be different from the inefficiencies that capitalist enterprises have, just as the inefficiencies of capitalism were different from those that feudalism had and from those that slavery had. Inefficiency is part of every economic system, always has been and is now. It is not efficient to have millions of people who want a job and don't have one. If you want an introduction to capitalism's inefficiency, I can introduce you to the fact that every capitalist system suffers from millions and millions of people that are unemployed, or proportionally. That's not an efficiency. That's a waste of people, a waste of potential, and a waste of resources. Other systems have different inefficiencies. But weighing them is not a basis upon which you're going to decide between systems, and it never was.
So thank you very much for an interesting and thought-provoking talk. So in your overview of Marx's analysis of capitalism, you alluded to what I believe is called the labor theory of value that he developed. So that's an idea. I've got the impression that it's come in for a lot of criticism, because maybe I'm oversimplifying here, but the idea is that goods have a certain value.
Right.
The company underpays its workers in order to extract profits from the difference between the value and what it pays the workers. That idea doesn't take account, for instance, of the prices that consumers are willing to pay for the goods. So I was wondering how
Yes.
it would be good.
Well, don't take this personally. Your question bespeaks the very absence of teaching this material that I was referring to before. If you actually read Marx, and by the way, it's not that difficult, I guarantee you. If you read Marx, you'll know that he makes a distinction between values and prices. He talks about prices and what causes them. He talks about values, which for him are something else. Nor is he the only major economist who did that. Smith and Ricardo also did that. So he tried to use his analysis of value to say, whatever else a commodity is, a thing produced in capitalism, it has in it a congealed amount of labor. Every society has to make a decision, whether it's conscious of it or not. How much labor will we allocate to making food? How much will we make to clothing? How much, because you only have a certain amount of labor and you have a set of desires. And so every society allocates labor one way or another. For Marx, the value of a commodity simply meant the amount of the total labor a society had that was allocated to the production of that good. That's a definitional logic, which he then used to explain why prices are what they are. But there was no equation of price to value. Let me go back to the first part of your question. Has there been lots of criticism of the labor theory of value? Absolutely. There's been lots of criticism about virtually everything Marx ever wrote because of what happened in the years since. But that's true of every theory of value. For example, the mainstream one that is taught in the United States has a different name. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's called the utility theory of value. Things are valuable because of the amount of utility they provide to the consumer. Try, please, to measure that. Please, come on. You're all smart folks. You think that's an easier concept to nail down? The utility theory of value? Exactly how much joy does that ice cream provide for you? How much money are you willing to part with? Will that vary with the temperature outside? Will it vary with the amount of calories you're counting? What? Every economic theory begins with a set of basic hypotheses upon which it builds its system. Marx started with labor because for him that was the key variable to focus on. Neoclassical economics, which developed in the 1870s, for those of you who know, was itself a reaction against Marx. They hated the labor theory of value because it was associated with Marx. They forgot, so let me make sure you all know, that Marx did not invent the labor theory of value. Marx took the labor theory of value. This may come as a shock to some of you, but just do the work, you'll learn. Adam Smith and David Ricardo, champions of capitalism. That's where the labor theory of value comes from. Marx thanks them profusely for it and then uses it to do things they never wanted to see done. This happens often in science. The people who develop a concept then get very upset with where their students take it. Marx was a student of Smith and Ricardo, took the labor theory of value in a way that was critical of capitalism. They had used it to celebrate capitalism. But if you see a lot of criticisms of the labor theory of value, be careful what these are criticisms of, because Marx's labor theory of value is not the same as Ricardo's and not the same as Smith's, and has more to do with this notion of how labor is allocated in a society than anything. Marx was not. Let me put it another way. When I teach in the American university system, we begin by assuming all students want to understand the great mystery of economics, which is, why is the price of something what it is? Why is the price of a hamburger $5 and the price of a Mercedes much more than that? And we begin. That's very nice. It's perfectly good to make an economics built on that question. I'm going to now exaggerate, but to make my point. Marx wasn't interested in that, and I'm not either. I got many more interesting things I want to understand about this economy than why the prices of things are what they are. I understand if you're a capitalist, you're very concerned about prices. But if you're somebody else, you might be interested, but you might have much higher priority subjects that you would. Marx is coming at it with a different agenda. And so he starts in a different place and takes it in a different way. By the way, just a footnote for some of you scholarly types. In 2012, a colleague of mine, Stephen Resnick, and I, we did a lot of work together, published a book called Contending Economic Theories. It was an attempt to create for an English reading public a book that systematically compares neoclassical Keynesian and Marxian economics so that a generation of students would have something to find. If you're at all interested, that's a title, Contending Economic Theories, Neoclassical, Keynesian, and Marxian. And the publisher is MIT Press in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Why MIT? Because it is the home of the most prestigious tradition in economics. Paul Samuelson, Robert Solow, all kinds of people were there. And we wanted very much to introduce the profession through a publisher that they all respect to deal with an argument that most of them do not understand.
Hey, thank you. So you make a point that capitalism is going to die, and we're probably going to be better off if we kill it sooner than let it die. Now,
you said that.
Sure. That's my interpretation of your.
Gotcha.
Good student. All right. So now, you also said that we don't teach the generation the issues, and I'm curious about your thoughts about, do you think there is potential to get quicker to a better solution if we were to teach the younger generation things properly and make it clear? And when I say education, I'm not talking about the education of yesterday, the Harvard, the Stanford, but I'm talking about the education of today and tomorrow, the YouTube and the likes.
Absolutely. I couldn't say it as strongly as I want to say it. Yes, that's why I'm here. That's what I now do. I try to teach critical thinking in the realm of economics. Look, let me be as blunt as I know how. This country has been like a bear hibernating for half a century. It's very serious. For half a century, since the 1950s, end of World War II basically, this country has been so freaked out about its Cold War struggles with socialism, communism, and all the rest, that it took the pathetic position of a 3-year-old. You know, a 3-year-old sees a scary thing, puts his or her hands in front of his or her eyes, and believes that the scary thing is now gone. And it takes a little further maturity to recognize that you can put your hand there, the thing's still there. And when you move your hand, boom. We are in a society that has not dealt seriously with the criticism of capitalism in 50 years. I once had a graduate student, I said, go read the congressional record, the literal record of every debate in the House of Representatives and the Senate, and find me a debate over the pros and cons of capitalism. Couldn't find it. We have not allowed a political leader, we have not allowed economics as a profession, which is my profession, to have people like me. The only, let me be real personal and honest. I'm a professor. I've been a professor all my life in the United States, despite my criticisms. And that's because I'm like a game player. When I'm in trouble and I need help, I wave my pedigrees. You all know what I mean. I went to the right schools, so I'm in the club. Even though I say strange things, I'm critical. That's sad. And our country and our society are weaker because we do not have a tradition of critical thinking, which we badly need in a system that's working as poorly as the current one is and is likely to continue. Those of you who remember what I said, that the average in the history of capitalism is 4 to 7 years since the last downturn. Our major downturn was in 2008 and 2009. Now you do the addition, 4 to 7 years, uh-oh, we're due for one. And Wall Street waits one. You think we have trouble in the United States with Trump now? Make Trump plus a recession over the next 12 months and try to ask the question again. This is a system whose instability rocks it. And yes, I think education that would open people to the enormous and productive and sophisticated literature that explores these critical perspectives would be an enormous contribution to solving the problems. So.
Thank you for your talk. I find it very refreshing because I'm from China. And 6 years ago when I came to the United States, I really hated my country's system. Now that I look back and see the great achievement that my country has made, I find that, probably there's some problem in the United States or in the Western world in general, which is, those capitalistic countries have great economic systems, but the political system is really backward or it hasn't been updated regularly. And you can see this from the amount of debts that the United States has. I think it's like $9 trillion US. In China, we have $4 trillion US in people's savings as of now. So the economy is really booming. But what I find in your talk is your perspective is a little bit too extreme. It's definitely, I think what my country did well was we find a really good balance point between efficiency and equality. Actually, those two are two different forces. So if you have better efficiency, it's really hard to get equality. So my question is, how would you suggest the current, in the current states, you have this government, you have this political system in your hand. How would you suggest those people who make those decisions to move forward into a more of an appropriate point where equality meets efficiency? And if any one of you, if you haven't been to China, please go there. And it's an amazing world. I wonder if you have ever been to China.
Not yet.
Okay, I think it's a right time to visit China.
Okay, let me
right now.
Let me respond. Some facts and then an interpretation of what's happening in your country. Facts do underscore what you have said. For example, The real wage in the United States has been stagnant now for 35 years. Let me drive home what that is so you all understand. Real wage in economics is a very simple measure. You take the amount of money a person gets on average and you adjust it for the prices that the person has to pay, because obviously if you get 10% more wages, but all the prices go up 10%, you're not better off. You can't buy any more with your extra 10% of money than you could before because the prices have gone up. The term real wage takes that into account. So it measures what you really can buy with whatever the wages are that you get. When you do that, the American real wage over the last 35 years is the same. Or let me be starker with you. Real wages in the United States are the same today they were late in the 1970s. The only reason Americans have been able to consume a rising amount in the last 70 years is because of two things they did. And for those of you who don't know, this is your life I'm talking about. Number one, a vast social change happened, and it is about women, particularly white in our country, white women who have left in the millions lives as homemakers, wives, mothers, and so on, and become members of the paid labor force, so much so that your generation, I would guess, simply assumes it. But that's new. That's how the family had enough money to sustain the illusion that they were participating in the American dream. Because every household, every married couple now had a second major money earner. But it turned out it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough because when mother or wife went out to work in massive numbers, she needed her own outfit for that. She needed a second car because we don't do public transportation in this country. It's against our religion, and so on. That was an attempt at humor there, what I just did. Okay. So the second thing American working class did to sustain the illusion was, you all know, debt. We borrow for our house, we borrow for our car, we borrow for the credit card, and in a stunning innovation of American capitalism over the last 25 years, we borrow to send our children to college, producing a level of indebtedness that is explosive, and which explains part of why we crashed in 2008 and why it is taking so long to recover. We can't handle our economic system. By contrast, real wages in China have increased many times over the last 20 years. There's no comparison. The working class standard of living in China is zooming by comparison to here. China's GDP grows in the neighborhood of 6 to 9, depending on how you count, % a year. We're lucky if we get 2 to 3% year after year. That's why the two economies are getting closer and closer, because we're slow and they're fast. Now, you can pretend all you want, and boy, Americans are good at that, but that's the reality. And somewhere, you have to deal with that. Number 2 point in response. China is taking advantage, understandably, of something much bigger than China. There is a decision made in the centers of capitalism that the places in the world where capitalism was born and grew to its modern power, and those places are Western Europe, North America, and Japan. Those places, as capitalism grew in these areas where it first got going and became big, and that's where it put its industry, that's where it put its warehouses, that's where it's put its offices and its stores. It's what you all know. You're living in New York. But along the way, it had to come to terms with the working class, and what it did was offer them higher wages. And so the wages here rose. Not as fast as the profits, but they rose to keep the system going. Because the inequality, if you let it get too much, blows the system up. So a point was reached around the 1970s when something happened to change everything. American capitalists looked at their working class, paying them the kinds of salaries that enable the American working class to have the standard of living it enjoys. But they also discovered in the 1970s the jet engine and modern telecommunications. And suddenly something was possible that had never been possible before for corporations, capitalists, to say to themselves the following: why the hell are we in the United States or Britain or France or Japan? We can now supervise production in a factory in China or India or Brazil with modern telecommunications as easily as we could before supervise the factory across the street. And we can fly anywhere in the world in a matter of hours. So our managers can. We don't need the American working class whom we overpay. And we're out of here. We're leaving. Capitalism, over the last 40 years, has abandoned the countries in which it was born and reached its maturity. And where did it go? To the countries in the world that gave the greatest reason to bring them. China, number one. A disciplined working class, a pretty well-educated working class, a politically controlled working class, and a cheap working class by comparison to the West. And of course, the capitalists maximizing profit, because that's what this system works with, they went. They're still going in massive numbers. China is where capitalism is succeeding. And we here in America are facing a very, very traumatic problem. Our capitalism is declining. There are pockets that are not. Google's probably one of them. But the larger society in which Google too has to survive is a society that is experiencing cutbacks of job opportunity, cutbacks of income, cutbacks of government services everywhere. Western Europe, North America, and Japan. The political implications, we're just at the beginning of understanding, but it's going to traumatize and trouble all of our lives for the rest of our lives. China is where capitalism is new, where it's going, where it's growing. We live in a part of the world of capitalism where it isn't, and that we are not prepared for, because that no one has prepared the American people or the people of Western Europe or Japan, which is why the trauma of politics is becoming so turbulent as this is slowly dawning on people. And they look to blame somebody. A favorite one is, of course, immigrants. Let's pretend it's all them who somehow are to blame. We'll just kick them out. It won't solve anything. We'll kick out the old politicians and bring in Mr. Trump. Doesn't solve anything either. Dump Mr. Trump, that won't solve anything either, because you're not dealing with what the underlying realities are that have provoked all of this situation. But I do believe that China is mostly the beneficiary of the transformation of capitalism, and will suffer, it's already suffering, but will suffer as capitalism moves its center to those parts of the world. It brings with it all of the history of turbulent class struggles that we know from what happened in Western Europe, North America, and Japan. So I would be a little more cautious about the future of Japan, but without denying that they are where capitalism is ebullient, where capitalism is growing. We aren't. We only sustained the illusion the last 40 years by having women go to work and borrowing like there's no tomorrow. But you don't need an advanced degree in economics to understand if the wages are flat, the real wage that American working class has, while it borrows more and more, a day will come when you don't have enough wealth to service the debt, to pay it off. And when that happens, it crashes, and that's what 2008 was. If capitalism was what's coming to China, as I believe it is, both Chinese and foreign, then the instabilities and inequalities of capitalism everywhere else will descend upon China too. Just a footnote. Last year, there were more new millionaires in China than there were in the United States. It's in a country that's much poorer than the United States. You got to wonder, where does that go? But that's the typical story of capitalism.
I'm sorry, we don't have time for more
Okay.
questions. Thank you for coming. And
Thank you all
educating
very
us.
much.
I wanted to mention we do have books, Democracy at Work.